Homeless black boy says he can wake millionaire's daughter. Doctors laugh. Then this happens. The frost hung thick on the windows of room 412B at the Vienna General Hospital, the largest and most advanced medical center in all of Austria. It was precisely 13:32. The white clock on the wall blinked steadily above a bank of softly humming machines. The air smelled of antiseptic, latex, and too much time. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic, just the mechanical rhythm of survival. Beep, pause, beep. On the hospital bed, wrapped in a powder blue blanket with tiny hand-stitched swans, lay 9-year-old Liana Weber. Her skin, once rosy and warm with laughter, had turned pale and still. Her dark chestnut curls tangled around her face like ivy vines trying to hold on. Tubes snaked around her tiny frame, feeding, breathing, monitoring. She hadn't spoken, moved, or opened her eyes in 8 days. The moment that tore everything apart came without warning. 1 second, she was giggling at breakfast with her father. The next, she collapsed while tying her shoelaces for school. Just fell, like a string cut mid-laugh. Doctors called it an acute cerebral failure, a spontaneous shutdown of her neurological system. So rare, even the top pediatric neurologists flown in from Munich and Zurich scratched their heads. She might wake up. One had said with a tight frown. She might not, another added. Almost in the same breath. By her bedside, Stefan Weber. Never left, not once. A former Alpine bridge engineer, Stefan was used to building what others said couldn't be built: arches that held up cities, roads that pierced mountains. But now, all that confidence had drained into the hospital floor. He held her hand, day and night. Thick, weathered fingers gripping fragile, ones with calluses that once bent steel and now bent in prayer. Nurses called it touching. Doctors called it hopeless. Stefan didn't care. This was his daughter. His world. And he wasn't going anywhere. But time is a cruel weight. And after a week, even hope starts to buckle. Words like insurance coverage, long-term care planning, and withdrawal protocol began sneaking into hushed hallway conversations. And then, just when it seemed like the last ounce of magic had drained from the world, he arrived, not a doctor, not a priest, not someone anyone had called. Leopold Kirchner, the billionaire tech magnate, who practically owned half of Austria's private medical sector. A man who once said, "I don't believe in luck, I believe in algorithms." Founder of Neurodyne Labs, owner of 3 private clinics, 1 football club, and an ego big enough to make headlines every week. He entered unannounced that Thursday afternoon. Leather trench coat, suede gloves, 2 bodyguards, 3 assistants. His entrance felt less like a visit and more like a royal inspection. Leopold had read Liana's story in a local online newsletter while sipping his hand-ground Kenyan espresso from a handmade ceramic cup. He saw a PR opportunity, and possibly a test subject. He offered Stefan something called the Awakening Protocol, a battery of neuro, AI diagnostics, virtual memory mapping, electrical pulse therapy, and brainwave repatterning, all top of the line. All experimental, and all at no charge. Stefan, bleary-eyed and ragged, only asked one question: will it bring her back? Leopold smiled thinly, slipping off his sunglasses with a practiced gesture. "Oh, I know how to wake your daughter up," he said. "Trust me. We'll give her the best tech money can buy. We'll upgrade her mind like it's an iPhone." The words echoed off the sterile walls like gunshots. Stefan stood slowly, placing Liana's hand gently back under the blanket. His voice, though quiet, carried enough weight to crack marble. "She's not a machine," Leopold chuckled. "Emotion makes people weak. Science wins, Mr. Weber." But Liana didn't stir. Not that day. The next. Leopold rolled in machinery the size of bathtubs, flickering lights, pulsing wires, augmented reality helmets placed gently over her eyes, sensors measuring everything from brain heat to blink potential. Nothing. Liana stayed still. Unmoving. Unreachable. One by one, the world's best consultants returned to their cities, leaving behind nothing but invoices and echoes. By Sunday night, even Leopold stopped visiting, but Stefan remained, reading her favorite books, playing voice notes of her mom's lullabies, whispering about snowstorms and mountains and old folk tales of Austria, telling her the moon had been so full last night it made the Danube glow. And then just after midnight came a knock on the window. A nurse, quiet, nervous. "Mr. Weber," she whispered. "There's a boy outside. Says he wants to help." "A boy?" She nodded. Stefan stepped into the hallway, and there, sitting on the bench beneath a flickering exit sign, was a barefoot boy. Maybe 10, maybe 11, brown-skinned, dressed in an oversized hoodie, the hem torn, the cuffs frayed, jeans dirty, feet bare despite the icy tile floor. But his eyes were still, and ancient. The kind of stillness you only find in the woods during snowfall or at the edge of dreams. The boy stood as Stefan approached. "Are you Liana's father?" I am," Stefan replied. "Who are you?" The boy didn't answer. Instead, he said 5 words that changed everything. "I can wake her up." Stefan stared. "What did you say?" "I can wake her up." It wasn't a boast. It wasn't dramatic. It was just truth, spoken quietly. "Certainly." Stefan, sleep-deprived and drained of even disbelief, let out a breathless chuckle. "You're just a kid." The boy nodded. Sometimes it takes someone small to remind people of big things. "Look, I appreciate it, but—" Stefan stopped. "She's not lost," the boy said gently. "She's listening. But she doesn't know if it's safe to come back." Stefan froze. "What do you mean?" "She needs something this place doesn't have," the boy continued. "What?" The boy looked him directly in the eyes. "She needs your pain. Your truth. The words you locked away to stay strong." Silence. Then, "Who are you?" The boy didn't answer. "Can I sit with her?" Everything in Stefan screamed no, but something older, something primal and aching inside, whispered, "Yes." "All right," Stefan said quietly. The boy entered the room. He stood beside Liana, laying one small hand on her forehead. His lips moved. Silently. Then he turned to Stefan. "Now you." "Me? She knows you're here. But she needs to know why you're here." Stefan looked at his daughter. The machines hummed. The white light buzzed overhead. Then he said the thing he hadn't said to anyone since. She collapsed. "I wasn't there, Liana." His voice broke. "I was in a meeting. I missed your breakfast. I missed your smile. I missed the warning signs. I should have been home. I should have known. I should have—" He stopped, sobbing. "I should have told you how proud I was." Tear dropped onto her hand. "I'm sorry." And then, just for a moment, the heart monitor blipped faster. Once. The nurse gasped. Stefan blinked. "Did you?" "I saw it," the boy said calmly. "She's listening." Then, as quietly as he came, the boy turned and walked to the door. "Wait," Stefan called. "What's your name?" The boy paused. "They call me Elias," he said. "I'll come back tomorrow." Then he disappeared down the hallway. Barefoot, silent, like a ghost wrapped in dust and certainty. In the room behind him, Liana's fingers twitched. And for the first time in 8 days, the machines began blinking with something new. Not routine. Hope. The first rays of morning crept across the rooftops of Vienna, casting golden lines through the hospital's frosted windows. Inside room 412B, Stefan Weber hadn't slept. He couldn't. He wouldn't. Because sometime just before dawn, Liana's index finger had twitched again. This time, it wasn't tied to a stimulus test or a machine signal. It came unprovoked, unprompted, like a whisper from somewhere. Far away, a whisper just for him. No one else saw it. No one else needed to. He did. By the time the new nurse arrived for her morning shift, she was already annoyed. Stefan tried to tell her about the barefoot boy, about Elias and the miracle he brought with 5 words and 1 gentle touch. But the nurse, tapping her sleek white tablet, frowned and shook her head. No visitors were signed in last night, Mr. Weber, and no child appeared on the security footage. Are you sure you weren't dreaming? Stefan didn't argue. He just turned back to his daughter, watching the rise and fall of her chest beneath the swan-patterned blanket. It didn't matter if the hospital couldn't see Elias. Stefan had. He'd felt the shift in the air, the strange warmth that settled like a breath held too long and finally released. He couldn't explain it, but he believed it. And that was enough. He found himself wondering again, where had the boy come from? How did he know Liana's name, her condition? Stefan hadn't told anyone outside family and the doctors. Yet Elias spoke like someone who had known her forever. More than that, he'd spoken like someone who knew Stefan. Not the quiet, grease-stained father who sat at her side now, but the man Stefan had been long ago, before his life narrowed into deadlines and spreadsheets and progress reports. Back when he still believed stories could save people, Liana loved stories, not flashy cartoons or superhero movies, but the old ones, the kind Stefan used to make up on long Sunday nights when her mother was still alive. Back when their world had warm lights and burnt toast and laughter echoing through every room. Liana would crawl into his lap and whisper, "Tell me again about the girl who spoke to the moon," and he would. He always would. Until he didn't. After the fire, after the accident that took his wife, Stefan buried the stories, along with the pain. He became busy, reliable, distant. He worked late. He stopped singing. He thought Liana hadn't noticed, but she had. She just never said anything. She just grew quiet. And now she was silent. Until Elias came, that afternoon, for the first time in almost a decade, Stefan prayed. Not with carefully chosen words or from some dusty religious book, but with raw desperation. God, if you're real, if you're out there, please, don't let this be it. And then, as if summoned by the crack in Stefan's armor, the door creaked open again. Elias stood in the doorway, same torn hoodie, same bare feet, same steady gaze. "I said I'd come back," he said simply. Stefan stood so fast his chair scraped the floor. "Where do you go? Who are you?" "I go where I'm needed," Elias said. "And I'm someone who remembers what others forget." He walked straight to Liana's bedside and rested a hand on her wrist. Closed his eyes. "She's closer today," he whispered. Stefan's heart kicked against his ribs. "Closer?" "She's been listening. Your voice reached her yesterday. But now she needs something else." "What? Tell me what she needs." Elias opened his eyes and looked at Stefan. "She needs the song." "What song?" "The one you used to sing, before the fire. Before everything went quiet." Stefan staggered back like he'd been struck. There was only one song, a lullaby. It wasn't famous, wasn't recorded anywhere, wasn't even written down. Just something his grandmother had sung to him when he was a boy. A simple melody, soft as candlelight. He had sung it to Liana every night when she was little, always right after telling her a story. He hadn't sung it once since the day they buried his wife. His throat tightened. I can't." "Yes, you can," Elias said, voice like velvet over stone. "Because she still remembers it, and so do you." Stefan sat beside the bed, hands shaking. For a moment, he was no longer in the hospital. He was in their old apartment. The one with the yellow curtains and the wobbly radiator. Liana was small. Again, curled up against him, giggling at his off-key notes. Her mother's laughter from the kitchen. Everything warm. Everything safe. He blinked the memory away, heart pounding, then opened his mouth. "There's light in the shadows. And stars in the rain." His voice cracked, but Elias nodded gently. "Hold on, little dreamer. You'll fly once again." And then, a beep from the monitor. Longer. Stronger. Not a warning. not danger, a rhythm. Liana's heart rate rose. The nurse burst into the room. Her vitals, she's responding to the music. Stefan didn't stop singing. Elias turned to him. You gave her something to come back to. Now she knows the way. Stefan's voice quivered. Why are you doing this? You don't even know us. Elias shook his head. You're wrong. I do know her. Stefan froze. Not her name, but her heart. He looked around the room, at the blinking machines, at the tight-lipped medical charts and graphs. Because I was a child once, in a bed like this, alone, afraid. No one came for me. No voice. No story, no hand. I waited and waited, but no one told me I was still worth coming back for. The silence that followed was deeper than anything Stefan had ever heard. I promised, Elias said quietly, that if I ever had the chance to change that for someone, I would. Stefan sank to his knees. You're like an angel. Elias didn't answer. He leaned toward Liana and whispered something Stefan couldn't hear. Then turned for the door. Wait, Stefan called. Will you come again tomorrow? Elias paused. If she needs me, yes, but I think. Your voice is stronger now. He stepped into the hallway. Stefan chased after him, but like before, the boy was gone. No footsteps. No open door. No sign at all. This time. Stefan asked the front desk. They checked the cameras. Nothing. No boy. No visitor. But none of that mattered. Because when Stefan returned to room 412B, Liana's eyelids were fluttering. She wasn't awake, but she wasn't lost either. She was on her way back. And for the first time in days, Stefan smiled. The next morning came wrapped in gray clouds and quiet hope. Snow flurries dusted the rooftops outside Vienna General as room 412B pulsed with something different. Not energy, not certainty, but presence. Stefan hadn't left his daughter's side, not even for a minute. His voice was raw from singing the lullaby over and over, not because anyone asked him to, but because each note, each word, brought Liana just a little closer. The monitors didn't lie. Her brainwaves were stabilizing, her vitals strengthening. It was subtle, sure, but unmistakable. Something was shifting. At exactly 6:02 a.m., Liana's right hand moved. Not a twitch, not a spasm. She reached for his. No test, no stimulation, no reflex check. Just a small hand reaching. Stefan crumbled. Tears soaked the blanket as he whispered her name over and over. Like a prayer, like a thank you, like a promise. Doctors didn't know what to say. Dr. Elise Lawrence, head of pediatric neurology, stared at her chart like it was written in a foreign language. This doesn't make sense, she muttered, flipping through brain scans and EEG results. We haven't administered anything in the past 72 hours. No new meds, no procedures, no interventions. The nurse beside her hesitated. What do we log this as? Dr. Lawrence frowned. Call it an anomaly. Stefan sat in the corner, holding his daughter's hand. You can call it what you want, he said softly. But I know what I saw. He didn't mention Elias, not to them. He didn't have to. That story wasn't for the doctors, not yet. Later that afternoon, Stefan stepped outside for the first time in 3 days. The world felt different. The sun didn't sting his eyes like it used to. The air didn't carry that heavy, bitter chill. It felt like breathing in a second chance. He walked to a corner store and bought a small spiral notebook. Not for records or appointments, for words, songs, truths, things he hadn't said in years. Because Elias was right, Liana didn't just need technology or treatments. She needed his voice. His honesty. His belief. Back at the hospital, taped to the outside of Liana's window, was a note, folded small. Written in blue pen, the handwriting uneven and childlike. Stefan opened it with trembling fingers. Sometimes the healing comes before the waking. Don't give up on her just because her eyes are closed. She hears you. Keep singing. He pressed the note to his chest. Elias had come again, not in body, but in presence. Liana's breathing changed after that. It deepened, slowed, became more human, less mechanical. Color returned to her face. And then late that night, she whispered, just one word. But it cracked. The sky. Double quotes, Papa. Double quotes. Stefan dropped the notebook. His legs nearly gave out. He leaned over, cupping her face in shaking hands. Liana? Baby? Can you hear me? She blinked slowly. Her lips moved again. You came back. I never left, he choked, tears spilling. She smiled faintly. Where's the boy? Stefan froze. You saw him? She nodded. He said he was the echo that found me when I was floating and couldn't see. Her voice was barely audible. He sang until I heard you again. He held my hand, she whispered, and said, your papa is waiting on the other side of the dark, so I followed the light. Stefan couldn't speak, could barely breathe. Every word landed like a stone dropped into a still lake, rippling something deep in his soul. He led you back, Stefan said. She nodded slowly. He smelled like dust and bread. He laughed like sunlight. He said his name was Elias. The next morning, the whole hospital was buzzing. Not loud, but low like the whisper of wind before a storm. Staff couldn't explain it. Liana's case didn't fit any pattern. No meds, no procedures. No reason. Just a girl who shouldn't have woken up but did. Because of a song. And a boy no one could find. Outside room 412B, a young intern obsessed with process and proof scrolled through security footage. He scrubbed every second from the past 48 hours, fast-forwarded, rewound, zoomed. There was Stefan singing, crying. But Elias? The hallway he walked through? Empty, every time. No trace, no shadow. The intern leaned back, goosebumps rising. That boy, he whispered, was never on camera. Meanwhile, in the room behind him, Liana and Stefan sat side by side watching cartoons. Her cheeks were pink again. Her eyes sleepy, but awake. Alive. Tell me the story, she said suddenly. What story? Stefan asked, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. The girl who whispered to the moon. Stefan blinked. He hadn't told that story in years. But she smiled and he knew. Elias had told her. She remembered. She hadn't forgotten. And neither had he, that night. Stefan didn't leave. He sat by her bed, notebook in hand, writing everything he could remember. Stories, songs, prayers, promises. He would never again let silence be his language. Just before midnight, he stepped into the dimly lit hallway for a breath of air. The wing was quiet, almost sacred. And then, from the far end, a familiar voice called softly, You did good, Mr. Weber. Stefan turned. Elias stood there, same hoodie, same dusty feet. But this time he was smiling wide. Stefan moved toward him. Elias, she doesn't need me anymore, the boy said. She asked for you. Now she has you. That's better. Stefan's throat tightened. Will I see you again? Elias tilted his head. Maybe, or maybe someone else will. What do I owe you? The boy's smile softened. Tell her stories every night, even when she's grown. Never stop singing. Then, he turned, walked toward the end of the corridor. No door opened. No footsteps echoed. He just vanished. But Stefan didn't run after him. He didn't need to. He just stood there, hand on his chest, full. For the first time in a long, long time. 3 months had passed since the morning Liana. Weber's eyes fluttered open and rewrote everything doctors thought they knew. 3 months since a barefoot boy with dust on his skin and stars in his voice reminded a grieving father how to sing. Stefan had told the story so many times now, sometimes to journalists, sometimes to wide-eyed children at the rehab center, sometimes just to himself in the quiet hours of early morning. Not because he needed to convince anyone, But because the words mattered, the story mattered. Liana's story was no longer just her own. Doctors labeled it spontaneous neural reintegration, a sudden reversal of an idiopathic cerebral collapse. Lots of long, elegant words that filled medical files and left mouths hanging open. But none of those words explained how Liana could describe Elias in perfect detail. His laugh soft and playful, the way his fingers felt warm even through her coma. How he smelled like bread, like someone who had been through storms and carried the scent of hope in his clothes. She remembered him saying, "You're not lost. You're just not finished yet." And that line, those few quiet words, became everything. Liana began therapy 1 week after she left the hospital. Her legs shook. Her hands barely held a pencil. But her will, unbreakable. Each time her legs failed, she whispered his name. Elias. Each time the fear crept in, she sang softly to herself, a tune Stefan had never taught her, but Elias had. And every night, Stefan sat at the old upright piano, playing the melody until her feet began to move like leaves on a breeze. Until she danced again. They sold the car first. Then the vacation cabin outside Hallstatt. Then the last remaining shares Stefan had in his former engineering firm. He didn't tell anyone. Didn't need to. Because for the first time in years, he wasn't working to build wealth. He was working to build something real. With stories. With songs. With healing. The money went into launching a program called Voices at Dawn, a free art and music center for children dealing with trauma, loss, or illness. The slogan, printed in bold blue letters beneath a mural of a child holding a glowing lantern in the dark, read, "Where silence ends and healing begins." The mural itself, painted by Liana, a figure in a hoodie too large, feet bare, standing in a dark tunnel holding out his hand to another child caught in the shadows. Below it, in Liana's handwriting, he didn't have wings. He had faith. People started asking questions. Where was the boy now? Was he real? What was his last name? Stefan never changed his answer. His name is Elias. I don't know where. He is now, but I know exactly where he was when it mattered. Some laughed, some rolled their eyes, but others wept. Because sometimes belief touches places that facts can't reach. One evening, Stefan and Liana took a walk through their old neighborhood. It was early spring. Snowmelt trickled through gutters. Birds returned to the trees. Liana wore purple. Rubber boots, even though there hadn't been a drop of rain in days. Why the boots? Stefan asked with a smirk. Just in case, she said, skipping ahead. Elias told me the best surprises happen when you're ready for them. They passed the closed-down train station, its doors chained, the windows smeared with dust and time. There beneath a broken street lamp sat an old man playing a harmonica. A cardboard sign rested at his feet, the writing faded but legible. "You're not lost. You're just not finished yet." Liana stopped. Grabbed her father's hand. "Papa." She whispered, eyes wide. "Look." Stefan approached the man slowly. "Where'd you hear that phrase?" he asked, his voice careful. The old man shrugged. "Heard it from a boy years ago. Played music with me for a while. Said he traveled light. Said truth didn't weigh much." "Did he say his name?" Liana asked. The man grinned, eyes sparkling beneath wild brows. "Said it was Elias, didn't he?" She beamed. "He's still out there." Stefan looked toward the horizon, feeling something stir inside his chest. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think he is." That night, Liana stood by her bedroom window, staring up at the moon. "You okay, little one?" Stefan asked, leaning in the doorway. "I was thinking," she said, hugging her stuffed giraffe. "What if Elias finds another little girl who's lost? And what if she's scared like I was?" Stefan crossed the room and sat beside her. "Then I hope someone is singing nearby." Liana nodded. "We should teach the world to sing." Stefan smiled. "You want to do that?" Yes, she said firmly. Like you taught me. But bigger, online, on YouTube. On rooftops, in kitchens, wherever people feel alone. He hugged her close. Then we'll do it. And they did. They launched a channel called Elias's Echo. Stefan uploaded songs from the hospital notebook. Liana shared her drawings, her laughter, her memories. They told the story without embellishment, without filter, just truth, fragile and whole. Within 2 weeks, the channel reached 2 million views. 4 months in, they'd received over 10,000 messages. From hospital beds, from shelters, from orphanages, from prison cells, from dorm rooms lit only by the soft blue of a phone screen. And each message ended the same way. I thought I was lost, but now, I think maybe I'm just not finished yet. On the 1-year anniversary of her awakening, Liana stood on a small wooden stage inside the Voices at Dawn Center. The room was full. Reporters, children, nurses, survivors. She held a microphone with both hands. Her knees trembled. But her voice did not. She sang the lullaby Elias taught her, the one that carried her through the dark dot. As she sang the final line, Stefan looked out into the crowd. There, in the back row, sat a boy. Barefoot. Dust on his cheeks, smiling gently. Their eyes met. And then he was gone. No door opened. No one else seemed to notice. No sound. Just faith. The next morning, Vienna woke to snow. Late spring snow, unexpected, quiet, thin as lace. At the Voices at Dawn Center, children gathered by the windows, breath fogging up the glass, watching the flakes drift down like slow-motion confetti. Liana stood among them, still in her purple boots, humming softly. She wasn't afraid of snow anymore. Not of silence either. Stefan watched her from the hallway, notebook tucked under his arm, the one he started the night Elias first disappeared. He didn't carry it like a father carrying notes or plans. He carried it like someone carrying something sacred. Inside it were pages filled with songs, sketches, dreams, half-remembered prayers, and all the things he used to hold back. That day, they filmed another video. Liana sat cross-legged under the mural she painted, the boy with outstretched hands and bare feet, and read letters sent from children around the world. One from a girl in Tokyo recovering from leukemia. One from a boy in Brazil whose father had left. One from a teenager in Ireland who said she hadn't spoken in 6 weeks until she heard the song and sang along. Each note ended with the same 3 words: I came back. Later that week, Liana received a small brown envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single page, crumpled at the edges, folded 4 times. Blue ink, crook handwriting. Tell your papa he did good. Tell him to keep writing. There are others still floating. And they need echoes. Liana brought it to Stefan, tears in her eyes. He's still watching, she whispered. Stefan nodded. I think he always will be. They framed the note and hung it beside the piano in the center's music room. Kids would ask about it. Some laughed. Others stared at it like it hummed with something they couldn't explain. Stefan never gave them the whole story. He didn't need to. He just said, it's a reminder sometimes the smallest voice carries the furthest. The Elias's Echo channel kept growing. They started a series called Midnight Songs, where every Friday, Stefan and Liana would upload a lullaby poem. Or simple melody, nothing flashy, no auto-tune. Just quiet truth. Some were in German, others in English. Sometimes they featured guest voices, kids from the hospital, former patients, volunteers who had stories of their own. One episode featured a boy named Milo, age 9, who had been mute for over a year after losing his brother in an avalanche. He stood on the stage, holding Stefan's hand, and simply whispered into the mic, I'm still here. The video got over 7 million views in 2 days, but it wasn't the views that mattered. It was what came next. Handwritten letters from remote villages in Poland, voicemails from mothers in Arizona, Voice memos from Ukrainian refugee camps. A nurse from Kenya who said her entire ward gathered every Friday to watch, because, some days, this is the only peace we get. One message came from a prison chaplain in Norway. I play your stories to the inmates. These grown men sit in silence, crying over a barefoot boy they've never met. And when I ask them why, they say, he believed in someone. No one ever did that for us. Stefan printed every letter. Every single one. He built shelves in the center just for them, not for show. For memory. For weight. For proof that echoes traveled. That one evening, after locking up the center, Stefan and Liana walked home under a navy blue sky dusted with stars. Papa, she asked, do you think Elias has a home? Stefan thought for a long moment. Maybe. Not a home with walls, but yes. I think wherever someone believes in him, that's home, she smiled. Then he lives in a lot of places now. The next morning, they received a package. No return address again. Inside was a harmonica, old and dented, wrapped in cloth. And a note. You said the world needs music. Teach them. One note at a time. E. Liana pressed the harmonica to her lips and played a shaky version of their lullaby. Stefan's hands trembled. He picked up the harmonica when she was done and whispered, he used to play with a man under the broken street lamp, remember? Liana nodded. They went back to that street lamp that evening. It was empty. The bench was cold, but the music lingered in the air like fog. Maybe he's with someone else tonight, she said. Maybe someone scared. Someone waiting. And Stefan realized something. This wasn't a one-time miracle. It was a calling. That night, he rewrote the mission for Voices at Dawn. It wasn't just about art or music or trauma recovery. It was about reminding people of what they forgot, about love, about stories, about how faith sometimes shows up barefoot and soft-spoken. A month later, they started training volunteers across Europe. Not professionals, just people with hearts and stories. They called them echo carriers. They showed up at children's hospitals with sketchpads and guitars, at foster homes with journals and lullabies, at refugee camps with chalk and harmonicas. They taught one message: you're not lost. You're just not finished yet. One night, Liana came to Stefan's room with tears on her cheeks. What if Elias disappears forever? Stefan knelt beside her. He won't, because as long as someone's still listening, he's still echoing. She nodded, quietly. And later that night, on the steps of the center, under the soft orange glow of the streetlight, they found another note, folded small, stuck under a stone. When the world forgets how to whisper, you remind them how to sing. You're doing it. Don't stop. No signature. Just the letter E. It had been just over a year since Liana Weber opened her eyes and whispered the word that lit her father's soul back on fire. 12 months since a barefoot boy showed up in a sterile hospital hallway and spoke a sentence that unraveled death's grip and reminded a city how to hope. And in that time, something beautiful had begun to spread, not just stories or songs, but a kind of quiet revolution. People didn't line up at Voices at Dawn to be fixed. They came to be heard. They came broken, unsure, lost in ways language couldn't always explain. And what they found wasn't therapy in the traditional sense. They found old guitars with 3 working strings, crayons in metal coffee cans, a piano that was always just slightly out of tune, blank walls that welcomed every handprint. They found the lullabies, the whispers, the songs. They found themselves. It started in Vienna, but the ripple grew. One hospital in Lisbon asked to host a satellite echo room. Then a community center in Bucharest, a refugee hub in Palermo. Each one carried the same inscription, always painted in blue. He didn't have wings. He had faith. Stefan traveled when he could, always with a backpack full of notebooks and voice recorders. But he stayed grounded in Vienna, because that's where Liana was, where the original echo started. And every night, no matter what, they closed the day the same way, sitting together by the window, telling a story, sharing a song. Not just remembering Elias, but becoming him. People kept sending in letters, thousands, and Stefan kept reading every single one. He started recording episodes called The Unseen Echo, where he would read letters aloud with nothing but piano in the background. One night he read a message from a young woman in South Africa who had lost her baby to illness and hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks. Her message read, "When I heard your daughter sing, something inside me cracked. I don't know what healing looks like yet, but for the first time in a long time, I want to know. Thank you. Please thank the boy if you ever see him again." That episode received no viral spike, no trending tag. But the next morning, outside the center, Stefan found a note taped to the door. "You thanked me. I heard. She's not alone anymore. Neither are you." And that's when Stefan began to understand Elias never left. Not really. He was in every note, every step forward, every whisper someone dared speak out loud. He was in the spaces between melody and memory. One rainy afternoon, a woman came to the center with a boy who hadn't spoken since a car accident a year earlier. His name was Otto, age 7, wild red hair, big green eyes. Stefan met him in the music room, handed him a sketchbook, and just sat beside him. No pressure. No questions. After an hour, Otto drew something. A child in a hooded coat, holding a ball of light. Underneath, in shaky handwriting, he wrote, "He found me." The next day, Otto whispered his first word in a year. "Light," Liana cried when she heard. "He's still helping," she said. That night she walked into Stefan's study while he was transcribing letters and said, "I think we should tell the full story. Not just pieces, not just songs, all of it. What happened? What we saw, what we felt. People need the whole thing." Stefan closed the notebook slowly. "You sure, sweetheart?" She nodded. "If we don't tell it, who will?" So they did, together. They filmed a video called The Day the Boy Came Barefoot. It was over an hour long, no music, no edits. Just Stefan and Liana on a couch, telling the story from start to finish. From the first twitch in the hospital, to the lullaby, to the harmonica, to the disappearing footprints, to the way his presence had changed their lives, without ever asking for anything in return. At the end of the video, Stefan looked into the lens and said, "We don't know where he is now, but we know what he left behind, and maybe that's the point." It went viral, not overnight, not through algorithms, but slowly. Honestly, it passed from teacher to student, from patient to caretaker, from stranger to stranger, from child to parent to friend. And it started to happen. More sightings, more notes. A little girl in Indonesia who described a boy in a hoodie who sat with her while she waited for heart surgery. A nurse in Wales who swore she heard humming in a patient's room minutes before he woke up. A pastor in the Philippines who found a harmonica on his altar, along with a scrap of paper that read, "They'll come back, just play." Each time, Stefan marked it in a binder labeled Echoes in the Wild. Liana called it their miracle map, but one moment stood above the rest. It was a cold night in January when a man in his 60s arrived at the center. He was thin, shoulders curved inward like someone who had spent decades trying not to take up space. He asked for Stefan by name, didn't say much. Just pulled a photo from his coat and handed it to him. It was old, creased at the corners. A black and white image of a child in a hospital bed. IVs, machines, monitors. That was me. The man said. Stefan looked up. The man's voice shook. I waited. A long time. Thought no one would ever come. He paused, eyes filling. But when I heard your daughter sing, it was like someone finally opened the door. He reached into his coat again and pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. A child's hoodie.frayed.dusty.tiny. I think, the man whispered. He gave this to me, before I forgot. Stefan didn't move. Coldn, single quotes D. He took the hoodie. With reverence. The man didn't stay, didn't explain. Just nodded and left into the night. Liana walked in moments later. Her eyes landed on the hoodie. She froze. That's it, she said. That's the one. And Stefan, voice barely above a breath, replied, Then he was here, before us, before Vienna, before me, and maybe we're not the first ones he saved. Just the first to tell the story. Liana looked at the hoodie like it was made of stars. And softly, she began to hum. Part 7, the song that never ends. The world didn't change all at once. It never does. But stories, real stories, they don't wait for permission. They move in silence, in whispers, in songs, sung from one heart to another. And the story of a barefoot boy named Elias had become exactly that. A current flowing beneath headlines, beneath doubt, beneath the cold machinery of modern life. You wouldn't see it in the news, but you'd hear it in the late-night humming of a nurse, in the quiet breath of a father who decided to stay one more night, in the soft, trembling voice of a child rediscovering the sound of their own hope. 1 year to the day since Liana first said, Papa. Voices at dawn held a celebration. They didn't call it an anniversary, they called it the return. A day not just to remember what happened, but to honor all the other stories unfolding quietly in its wake. Hundreds gathered at the center. Parents, doctors, survivors, skeptics, believers, children carrying harmonicas, teenagers in worn hoodies, strangers with open notebooks. Liana stood on the small stage with the hand-painted mural behind her, the barefoot boy reaching from the dark, her voice steady, her eyes full. She sang the lullaby, the one Elias first whispered to her in the dark space between coma and waking. The one that reminded her she was never alone. There's light in the shadows, and stars in the rain. Hold on, little dreamer, you'll fly once again. When she finished, the crowd didn't clap right away. They just breathed. Like everyone needed that last note to settle in their bones before they could move again. Then, slowly, applause built like a wave, gentle and rising. But Stefan wasn't watching the stage. He was watching the back row, and there again he saw him, small frame, bare feet, dirt-streaked hoodie, sitting still. Eyes glowing soft like twilight. Their eyes met. And for the first time, Elias smiled and nodded. Stefan stood. But by the time he reached the back row, the seat was empty. No door had opened. No one else saw. But Stefan wasn't surprised. He turned around and found a note resting on the chair. It read, You remembered, she sang. That's all it ever takes. No signature. Just a small sketch at the bottom of a swan with wings stretched wide. That night, back at home, Liana couldn't sleep. She stood by her window, the same way she had a year ago, and stared at the moon. Do you think we'll ever see him again? She asked. Stefan joined her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Maybe. Not the same way, but I think we'll feel him. Every time we sing, every time someone chooses love over fear, every time someone whispers into the dark and someone else answers. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Then I want to be like him. You already are. The next morning, they launched a new branch of the center. Not a building, but a movement. The Echo Project. A mission to place art kits, notebooks, and musical instruments in every children's hospital and shelter they could reach. And more importantly, recording devices. Because everyone has a story. And every story deserves to be heard, soon. Videos started coming in from everywhere. A girl in Morocco writing her first poem about grief. A boy in Detroit learning to play his mother's lullaby on a ukulele. A teenager in Seoul painting his nightmares into constellations. Each one ended with the same phrase, now spoken like a mantra. I thought I was lost. But now I know I'm just not finished yet. One day, months later, Stefan and Liana visited a new hospital wing in Prague that had just adopted echo rooms. As they walked the halls, they passed a mural being painted on the west wall. It was clearly unfinished, but the outline was familiar. A small figure in a hoodie. One hand stretched behind him, offering light to someone in the shadows. Liana stared. That's him. The nurse nearby smiled. Oh, you know the story too? The kids here love it. They say he visits in dreams. Some even draw him before they've ever heard about the center. Funny, huh? Liana didn't answer. She just watched the mural in silence. That night in the hotel, Stefan found a folded piece of paper slipped under the door. He opened it carefully. It said, "Wherever one voice dares to speak the truth, wherever one child chooses to believe instead of break, I'll be there. And so will you. Keep singing. I'm listening." No city listed. No contact. Just a note. Just an echo. And somehow that was enough. Years passed. Liana grew. The center expanded. The world, with all its noise and pain, kept turning. But the echoes remained. Quiet miracles stitched into the fabric of daily life. And one evening, just before a thunderstorm broke across Vienna, Stefan walked through the music room and found a little girl sitting at the old piano, playing that same lullaby, note by note. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked gently. She looked up, smiling. "A boy showed me," she said. "He smelled like the earth after rain." Stefan smiled too, blinking back tears, and sat beside her because the truth was simple. Miracles aren't always thunder and lightning. Sometimes they're dust on your fingers, a paper note taped to a window, a song sung just loud enough for one heart to hear. Sometimes they're a little girl whispering to the moon, or a boy with no shoes, laughing at the impossible until it isn't impossible anymore. Elias didn't wake Liana up. He reminded the world how and it hasn't stopped echoing since.